I'm Tara Michelle Zinnick. I'm the editor of this magazine. I'm going to do a little intro to the magazine and the issue that we're promoting right now and the event. And I'll introduce our moderator and we will go from there. Before we get started, I want to do a quick land acknowledgement to acknowledge that the land that this magazine's offices and our speakers tonight are located on is the ancestral and territorial territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. This land is currently home to a diverse urban Indigenous community, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land as guests. As far as an intro to this magazine, for those who don't know, this magazine is an independent magazine. We started 55 years ago as an education publication. We now print bi-monthly and we host all kinds of subjects that to do with progressive politics, arts and culture. We do themed and open issues, reported pieces, personal essays, opinion and culture writing. We showcase emerging and experienced Canadian writers, including fiction writers and poets, with a focus on new writers and writers who face barriers to the traditional publishing industry. We do topics such as labor, climate justice, Indigenous identity, housing, and tonight's topic, pop culture. Our pop culture issue is part of our, it's one of our annual culture issues. So sometimes those are themed, sometimes they are not. The issue right now should be on stands and for subscribers should be getting to your mailboxes soon. And it has a lot of really great pieces in it, including some by people who are here tonight and some from people who are not. I don't even know where to start with the issue, but a couple highlights I'll give. Our back page letter is addressed to Alexis Rose, talking about casual racism on Schitt's Creek. We have a column on science fiction and sex work and why sci-fi doesn't imagine better worlds for sex workers. And we have a personal essay on High School Musical and how Western high schools actually differ from the world seen on High School Musical. I'm going to let the speakers tonight talk about their pieces, those who have pieces in the issue. And as far as this talk series, in the fall of 2018, this magazine launched We Need to Talk About This, our national talk series. We held events in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto. Each city featured a different topic ranging from mental health to racism in Canada's healthcare system and included a diverse range of speakers. The talk series was on hiatus in 2020, but has just relaunched in 2021. We hosted one event where we discussed Canada's housing crisis, and tonight's event is the second in the series. The big question we're asking tonight is, how is pop culture political? During the speakers, I'm going to post people's links to their social media, websites, and so on, if you want to keep in touch with them or see what they're doing, as well as some more information about how to subscribe to the magazine and how to follow us online. And now to intro Lisa, who is going to be our moderator tonight. Lisa Whittington Hill is the publisher of this magazine. Her writing on pop culture has appeared in The Walrus, Hazlitt, and Long Reads. She is currently writing a book for Bloomsbury's 33 1/3 series on Beauty and the Beat by the Go-Go's. Girls Interrupted, her collection on essays on how pop culture is failing women, will be published by Vehicle Press in 2023. She's also an instructor in the magazine publishing program at Centennial College in Toronto. And just before I hand it over, just if people have questions, housekeeping questions or questions for the panelists, just drop them into the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah Michelle. Thank you also to our panelists tonight, who we're going to hear from in a minute, and to all of you for joining us. We had some technical problems with the question and answer box, but I think it is all fixed. I'm really excited to be moderating our discussion on pop culture today. It's a topic I really, really love. It will also give me a break from reading about Pete Davidson and Kim Kardashian West and their totally not a PR stunt relationship, which is what I've been reading about all day. I said I wasn't going to mention them and I did. I apologize for that. Tonight, as Tara Michelle mentioned, we're going to explore a big question for the evening, which is, how is pop culture political? We've got 4 great speakers who are going to talk for about 10 minutes each. We'll have the Q&A at the end, so get your questions ready. And we're also recording this, so if you have to leave us before we're done, we'll have the recording available after. So again, thank you all for being here, and thank you for our panelists. Let's get started. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker of the evening. Sadaf Ahsan is a Toronto-based arts and culture writer, host of Frequency's pop culture podcast, The Reheat, and a sex columnist for Best Health. She previously worked at Now Magazine and the National Post, and her work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, Refinery 29, Bitch, and Chatelaine.
First of all, I just want to thank Tara Michelle, Lisa, and also that amazing opening. And I'm so happy to be here with all these amazing panelists whose work I genuinely love so much, and getting to talk about a subject I love probably too much. So first, what I'm thinking is, why don't we define pop culture a little bit? You know, it's a hard thing to do because it's a very big space, but the way I see it is that it's all the things that entertain us and also maybe sometimes don't. And although it's considered what's meant to be popular, I actually think it's really what ultimately provokes thought. And that can be different things for different people. Everybody here, you know, we're talking TV, movies, music, even sports, but also memes and GIFs. And yes, I say that with a soft G, so please don't judge me from here. I want to start there because I think it's so essential to understanding where pop culture and politics sort of intersect. So much of this thing that we love is maligned. It's considered trash, empty, void of depth, a brain cell killer, plastic. To that I say, what is so bad about trash? Okay, so sure, pop culture spans from highbrow to lowbrow, but most things do. And whatever it's stemming from, we all connect with certain messages and material, and that says something about us. You know, it's what has us asking even how is pop culture political in the first place, when I actually think that one of them can't really exist without the other one. And I think that starts with the fact that the way we even share pop culture suggests that it shapes who we are socially. So for example, the way we react to news on social media, what we post, the stuff that we like, but also the way that we share it with our friends and our family. So something that I think a lot about is the way that a key foundation of pop culture is gossip, which I personally really love, and discussion and being a part of a fan base. And so one of my favorite pop culture moments of this year has been, and I'm sure I'm not alone, but Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez getting back together. It was the subject in all my group chats and my work meetings, with my mom, with whoever I was dating at the time, because it felt like my birthday, to be honest, and it makes me very happy. I digress. But you know, it was the same thing when anything happened that was huge in pop culture. When Meghan Markle and Prince Harry had their sit down with Oprah, even the way, I'm sorry, Lisa, to bring it up, but if Kim and Pete are dating, I think they might be. These are all lightning rod moments. And especially during the pandemic, when we relied on apps and Zoom and texts and phone calls more than we ever have. I certainly did. And I think it's always been a connective thread for us. It's how we bond. We're social creatures. And it's also how we establish hierarchies. So that's between our friends and family. You know, you share gossip with someone who you know can keep a secret. I can keep a secret, FYI, if anyone wants to share anything with me. But it's also, you know, celebrities for us are kind of like our modern monarchy. I know that's a little bit of a bad word, but I think it is the truth, and that matters. And that's because as a social shaper, pop culture is so representative of our personal beliefs, the things we love and we hate, our values. It's a bridge between who we are and the political sphere. And that means that, in a sense, pop culture is a really great way of understanding all those systems that hold so many of us back. And so I'm referring to patriarchy, bigotry, sexism. I mean, we don't all have the power, the privilege of a Kardashian, sure, but the way we move through this world and the way that it holds us back isn't that dissimilar. And that's something that I talk a lot about on my podcast, The Reheat, with my co-host Sarah Sahagian, which is not a plug, maybe a little, but I bring it up because this is such an important subject to us. And on our show, we examine this exact subject by looking at the ways older stories in Hollywood sort of have these same trends in pop culture that we've been seeing forever, and the way that they hold a mirror to our society. And again, what those values are. So some of the things that we've discussed that I really think falls under this question is, for example, the legacy of Bruce Lee. He was a really great actor. He was a great martial artist. He was also a great dancer, by the way. I don't know if everybody realized that. But he was also an advocate who spoke out against anti-Asian racism in the 60s before his very early death. And his words actually became a common chant all over again in anti-Asian racism rallies just over this past year. His face was everywhere. And then if you look at Whitney Houston and George Michael, both of whom I love, they both struggled with homophobia in the music industry. And, that experience derailed their music careers. It also really impacted their mental health. So you're seeing struggles all this time on that stage that are so relatable. And we're dealing with them today, but we can finally talk about them today because these are all raging political issues now. And even though that's terrible, it's giving us another lens into the subject that maybe we should have been talking about so long ago. And, this is why I also think it's so worth noting the massive influence that pop culture has on politics and vice versa, of course, because pop culture is this great way that sort of funnels the way we live through a lens that makes it easier to understand and to relate to. It's why a movie that I love, 2016's Get Out, I'm sure a lot of you do, it's why I connected with so many people. Suddenly what it feels like to experience racism and to live in a society that is so deeply embedded in what I think we can call a new wave of conservatism. It's why it became so much clearer to those who are not people of color and maybe don't experience that. It started this massive discussion. And then you watch something like, this is very topical, but a Hallmark holiday movie. I won't lie, I love those terrible movies. I'm going to watch them again this Christmas. But you watch one, and if you're able to read between the lines, you know that this is a company that has a huge history of refusing to hire people of color and LGBT actors. And that establishes something. Hallmark's largest viewer base is actually red states. Its mission is to project family values, which I find to be a terrifying term. It's a coded word for right-leaning values, but when you watch those movies in opposition to Get Out, you discover that there's this whole other part of the world that believes white people with blonde hair and blue eyes who fall in love in small town America are the perfect ideal. And, in those places, in those movies, queer people don't exist. People of color don't exist. And that teaches viewers that that's what's right. That's the ideal. It's kind of perfect. And that perpetuates so many of the issues we're facing. It's this sort of nasty cycle that goes back and forth. And the same goes for The Bachelor or Big Brother. But then you have this amazing thing where you have all these filmmakers and artists like Jordan Peele who are turning the tables and they're educating us right back and they're changing the status quo. And I love that. I mean, that's how you use pop culture as a tool to change the political conversation. And it feels like, you're sending a Trojan horse out into the White House. And that's great. Like, this is how we get into people's heads in a way they're not expecting. So here's another example. I wrote a piece recently on, I'm sure a lot of you have watched these great horror movies that I do love, but there's a particular trend that I was taking a look at. It's the demon seed trend. So we've seen it in Rosemary's Baby. We've seen it in The Omen. Usually the mother, her womb is eventually overtaken by this evil son, probably the demon, probably Satan. He wreaks havoc on her body. He takes over and he makes her seem crazy, quote unquote crazy. And when you unpack that, something even as seemingly apolitical as that, seemingly harmless, you see how much that says about the way we look at new moms, at women as being crazy and plagued with mommy brain and needing a husband's strong hand to help stabilize her. I hate even saying those words, but you know what I mean. And if you even do a little bit of research, you actually find out that mommy brain is not a thing. Women are actually their most aware when they've just had a baby because they have a child to protect. But you also learn that this pattern, this demon seed pattern, is a look at the way men have historically made economic and political decisions over women's bodies behind their backs. And that's reminiscent of the way abortion or even the sale of menstrual products are being viewed now and debated over. It's not an ancient concept that healthcare systems are patriarchal, and this is a really easy way to see that and learn about it. And I think one of the biggest examples that we all are so familiar with is Britney Spears and her conservatorship. Here's a massive issue. It's been dissected far and wide. I won't get too deep into it, but I will say one thing that's been kind of a bright spot about it all is that it's really brought this beautiful spotlight to the countless problematic conservatorship cases that are involving disabled people around America. That wasn't a discussion before, but because this popular celebrity is experiencing it, we're all talking about it, we're Googling it, we're finding out what a conservatorship even means. And in doing that, we're finding out about this whole other reality. And we can make a difference when we do that. And I think that's a really, really powerful part of this entire relationship. And the last thing that I really want to touch on is actually the story that I wrote for this magazine, for the pop culture issue. And it's very near and dear to my heart because it's about the Real Housewives, who I love, again, probably too much. I consider them God's gift. Now, I also consider them very feminist, and that is a controversial idea. But, you know, it was interesting because when I was writing it, I felt like I was writing a defense. I was gritting my teeth half the time I was writing it. And I'm sure so many of you, when you talk about the movies that you love or the shows or the real housewives you love, sometimes you bring it up and maybe you get a side eye or someone sort of smirks at you. And I think that speaks to this broader way that we view pop culture, which is so often assumed to be superficial nonsense, just relegated to women. And that's because almost anything that falls under pop culture is sort of trapped inside this incredibly limiting gender binary, which suggests that anything that has prestige is living in the masculine. Anything that deals in celebrity lives in the feminine. So we have Tony Soprano, we have Don Draper. We're embarrassed and so disgusted by a Real Housewife, even though they're actually not that different. So there's no mistaking, obviously, that so much of reality TV's audience is women and gay men. But anything with that specific audience is usually the target of disdain because it's seen as emotional, lacking depth. But the Real Housewives are women who have been through it all: domestic abuse, suicide, bankruptcy, infidelity, motherhood, divorce, you name it. They've built their own businesses, they're raising children, most of them daughters actually, as single mothers, and they're of an age that TV has pretty much decided otherwise are at the end of their life. They've reached their expiry date. So on these shows, they get to be messy and then everything in between. There's no room for toxic positivity or respectability politics, which, by the way, neither of which benefit marginalized people, who are the exact demographic. And Real Housewives has entire casts comprised of Black women. Where else is that happening? So here's the thing. How beautiful is it that pop culture is this place that gives a voice to the marginalized, to people of color, to queer people, to women, and sort of reminds people that we exist. You know, it's a really cool thing to have that and to use it as a social and political tool. And I think the thing that I just want to hit back on is that it connects us, it builds bonds, it gives us the space. There's so many sort of could haves and should haves that are sort of flouted around pop culture. But what I love about it is that it just is, you know, it's a place where we get to be excited and ambitious and shameless and thirsty, everything. It's liberating, it's entertaining, because that's the place where you get to have personality and character and also provoke thought. And I think the best part of it is that it's a lens to the way we view society. And that's really, really powerful. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sadaf. Thank you so much. Lots there. A reminder, put your questions in the Q&A. We have some questions there. We also have a discussion going in the chat. So much great stuff. I like that it only took us like 3 minutes in to mention Ben and Jen, the best celebrity. They're back. They're back. And Tara Michelle mentioned the issue, but our pop culture issue, which is out right now, and the Real Housewives piece that Sadaf wrote is really, really amazing. You can also read it on our website. Thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Stacy Lee Kong. Stacy Lee Kong is a writer, editor, and the founder of Friday Things, a weekly newsletter that delivers smart takes on the week's biggest pop culture stories, or at least the ones she can't stop thinking about. Her bonds have appeared in publications including Maclean's, The Globe and Mail, Reader's Digest, and En Route, and she has worked with some of the largest magazine brands in Canada, including Flair, Canadian Living, House and Home, and Chatelaine. She's also an instructor at Centennial College in Toronto.
I would just like to start by saying that everything that Sadaf said about this like feeling of pop culture being dismissed, and it's not something that we should like talk about or take seriously, like all of those things, I felt that my entire career. starting working mostly at women's lifestyle magazines, but especially when I pivoted to talking about pop culture. So I'm just like personally very excited to have a thoughtful, smart conversation with like all of these people who are kind of approaching pop culture from the same perspective as me. And also, to be clear, it's not just us, right? So I would argue that this way of parsing pop culture actually has a really long history, especially in cultural and linguistic anthropology. So as I was trying to find, because like I will never break the reporting habit. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to say that. And then I need a proof, a source. So as I was kind of looking for someone, I came across this quote from an American anthropologist and linguist. Her name was Jane H. Hill. In 2005, she wrote about finding culture in narrative. So she said, cultural and linguistic anthropologists now agree on one fundamental point, that narratives are not merely overtly about some content, such as what happened when, where, and to whom, but that they somehow make public the covert underlying presuppositions that organize the worlds in which speakers live. The cultural knowledge that resides in these presuppositions is often so transparent to speakers that it is unutterable. So what Hill is saying here is that there's all of this information that's embedded in narratives about stories, really, about what a culture values, what's considered important in a society, who actually is considered important, who's considered disposable, what kind of behavior we think is acceptable, what is scorn-worthy. And okay, admit the next part is not Hill, it's me, but does that not sound like celebrity gossip to you? Like the same people who write off pop culture, who argue that it's meaningless because celebrity gossip in particular is about a rarefied group of rich, beautiful, privileged, mostly white people and what they do and say to one another, they're arguing that these things are completely separate from the real world. But if you apply Hill's logic, you see that that's actually nonsensical. Pop culture is a collection of shared stories that tell us about who we are. So to start with, let's like think about the shared story part. So if you pay attention to entertainment journalism in particular, you've probably heard about the death of monoculture. So in this context, monoculture refers to like those cultural juggernauts that everyone knows about because we watch the same movies and the same shows and we read the same books and we listen to the same music. And this idea of the death of monoculture, I saw it a lot in 2019 in particular, because several major franchises were coming to an end. So Game of Thrones, Star Wars, the first phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with hot Chris Evans, like all of those things were wrapping up. And absolutely my favorite Chris, I'm sorry, I feel like that's basic, but that's where we are. So there was this like anxiety among cultural critics at that time that said, you know, we may not ever be connected by pieces of media in that way again. Like there just may not ever be a Game of Thrones that we're all watching and hating the ending because it was bad. Like there was this idea that because our entertainment choices were really governed by an algorithm or algorithms based on different streaming services, that we'd just be served up the things that we were most likely to click on, and we wouldn't like all congregate to something. So I think if you've been through the pandemic, you know that that was an unfounded fear. Obviously, streaming services, I think, made it possible for more people to engage with the same content. And in the way of content, like there's always one thing that takes off. We all were watching Tiger King. And I would argue I'm like the worst TV watcher ever. So even if you did not actually watch Tiger King, you kind of watched Tiger King because there were so many memes, there were clips, TikTok was already a thing at that point. So you could watch like the highlights of the show without ever logging into Netflix. And more recently, the same thing happened with Squid Game. Like I haven't watched Squid Game, but I know that it's about, like, I know what it's about. I can sing that stupid song, or I can at least hum it. Like all of these things enter the kind of public consciousness. But I would argue that we actually already had another monoculture waiting in the wings, and that is celebrity culture. So thanks to Instagram and now TikTok, it's easier and easier and easier for celebrities to build what feels like a direct relationship with their fans and with like audiences at large. And they did that largely just by like parceling out bits of information about themselves. Like, here's a thing I like. This is what my bedroom looks like. Here's my opinion on this political statement. And that drives interest, which drives coverage. which drives monoculture. And I think this really amped up during the pandemic when celebrities did not have the same income opportunities that they had had in the past, right? So during the pandemic, there were no shows being made, there were no movies being made, especially at the beginning. You could drop an album, but you couldn't tour to promote it. And so I think it incentivized this use of social media in this way. And just like it did before the pandemic, but like just amped up to 11, it was still driving all that interest. In fact, it wasn't just like a soft marketing tool anymore. It was like a hard revenue driver, because you would see someone like Anna Kendrick doing this brand deal where she's like singing on her Instagram instead of singing in a commercial on TV. So not to say that we haven't always paid attention to celebrities, but I think post-pandemic, they're ubiquitous in a different way than they were before. And that really underlines the fact that they are a source of shared stories for us. So the next thing then is that those shared stories, they reflect our values back to us. So as I mentioned, and as Sadaf mentioned, one of the big critiques of pop culture is that it's shallow and it's unimportant. But pop culture is a mirror. It shows us what and who our society values. So going back to Hill's point, there are so many unspoken assertions about our society in every single celebrity story. Like literally, the reason you see a celebrity trend and then like a profusion of hot takes is not because people are like hungry for clicks and searching for things to search about, or at least not just that, but also because there are so many dynamics at play, right? So there's race and gender and sexuality and ability and class, and celebrity stories are also stories about oppression, about mental health, about labor, which is a huge area of interest for me, about marketing, about business ethics. Like the story is not Britney Spears. The story is not, well, actually Ben and Jen might just be the story, but like, aside from that, the story isn't just this celebrity. It's not just this famous person. It's what they mean and what they say about the world that we live in. So obviously I have examples. I will give them to you. So when news resurfaces that Chrissy Teigen cyberbullied a then 16-year-old Courtney Stodden, sent them DMs telling them that they should no longer be alive, does that not bring up questions about purity culture, about the way that we communicate online versus the way that we communicate in person, and why we treat one of those as a more real social space than the other? For me, it also brought up these questions about why feminist publications weren't devoting the same kind of analysis to Chrissy Teigen's bad behavior that they did to other people's. And that is really about in-groups and power and access and capitalism, which I'm going to say 17 more times because it's all about capitalism. When Taylor Swift decided to re-record her first 6 albums, it wasn't like an individual contract negotiation that went viral. No one actually cares about the contract. What they care about is that this was an example of how exploitative business practices permeate the music industry. It's about intellectual property and who is allowed to actually hold their intellectual property and how much intellectual property is worth. It's about capitalism again, because money. Even so, I wrote about this in Friday Things last week, when Taylor decided to use All Too Well, which is a song that is widely understood to be about an unequal relationship between her and Jake Gyllenhaal, who's like 9 years older than she is, as the key marketing vehicle for the re-release of Red. That was really about power and how she could reclaim that power, and also capitalism, because like it sold so many copies. Or another thing that I've written about recently is when the crowd surged at Travis Scott's Astroworld Festival, 10 people died. That's not just a like disaster story. That's not just, oh, people died. There's also all of these other meanings, because that was also about apathy and exploitative labor practices and Scott's professional responsibility to his customers, which is my argument that he's not a performer with an audience. He is also a provider of goods and services who has an actual professional responsibility to the people who purchase those things. Also, that's about capitalism. So to me, the most interesting thing is that pop culture doesn't just show us who we are. It gives us, especially those of us who don't belong to this dominant culture, who are racialized, who are queer, who are gender nonconforming, all of these people who are poor, that gives us an opportunity to critique those societal values, either through discussing pop culture or through actually making pop culture. And I think that's important because it's easy I think someone could look at me and be like, okay, you don't know me. It's maybe hard for you to empathize when I talk about my experiences of racism or sexism, or, you know, the way that I understand my own attractiveness and who I'm attracted to, or the way I understand body image or beauty or whatever. But Lizzo's your girl. You love Lizzo. And this happens to her too. The last point I want to make also is a very practical one. So according to Viva data, which tracks Canadians' media consumption, in an average week, 93% of Canadian adults watch TV on any screen or device. They spend an average of 22 hours a week consuming television content. More than 1 in 5 adults have increased their use of audio streaming services due to the pandemic. Nearly 1 in 4 adults indicate that their consumption of print or digital magazine content, so like not news, but lifestyle, the other stuff, has increased during the pandemic. And according to StatsCan, in 2018, 78% of Canadians who were online regularly used at least one social networking account. So Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. And that number rises to over 90% for those in their teens, 20s, and early 30s. There are a whole bunch of sexist, ageist, racist assumptions about who is interested in pop culture, and that definitely informs the way that it can be dismissed. But most people watch TV. Most people listen to music from time to time. Most people have a passing understanding of who Beyonce is. So isn't it irresponsible to pretend that those things don't matter? If I had a mic, I would drop it, but now I'm just done.
Okay. Am I unmuted? Thank you so much. I wish I had like a mic drop kind of sound I could make. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stacy. So much good information there. Maybe if we have time at the end, we can argue who the best Chris is. I think you mentioned Evans, but I'm sure people make a solid case for Pine and all the other Chris's out there. Messina, yes, okay, Messina, yes. Coming in the chat now. So we've got some information in the chat. We are sharing all the great podcasts and newsletters that our panelists do, all their social media accounts, so you can follow them. As long as it's not Pratt, definitely, as long as it's not Pratt, we could do a whole session about Pratt. Okay, and remember, put your questions in the Q&A. Stacy mentioned Tiger King, and we have a question that references Tiger King, so maybe we'll get into some Tiger King. Okay, so our next speaker, thank you, Stacy. Okay, our next speaker is Amanda Scriver. Amanda is a journalist best known for being fat, loud, and shouty on the internet. Amanda is the co-host of High Lowbrow, the podcast. The show is packed with highbrow takes on lowbrow culture alongside co-host Danita Steinberg. Bi-weekly, the two attempted to have thoughtful convos about pop culture that is often overlooked, laughed at, trashed, and brushed. When Amma isn't busy with the pod, they write and have had their work printed in Refinery 29, the Toronto Star, the Walrus, Chatelaine, the Washington Post, Healthline, and Extra. They live in Toronto, Canada, with their partner, who recently named Amma the director of snacks. What a fabulous title. And together they obsessively watch TikToks and memes and are trying to determine the best potato chip buffet combo. And suggestions are welcomed. So maybe we can talk about, after we're done arguing about Chris's, we can talk about snacks. Okay, take it away, Amanda.
I don't know how I'm supposed to follow Stacy now, because Stacy just did that whole mic drop thing, and I'm like, how do I go now? Anyways, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you so much. And Stacy, Sadaf, you've both been incredible. When I was trying to think about what makes pop culture political, really, I was thinking about this from being a fat person and dealing with the internet each and every single day. So that was sort of the approach that I took to this. And realistically, much like yourself, Sadaf, I am also obsessed with the Real Housewives. So I decided to write about reality television, and being a fat person who is obsessed with reality television and also loves it and feels like they have to defend it all of the time. So as we all know, reality television has been an insanely popular genre for years and years and years. Like that's no doubt. But while we all love to celebrate it, others vilify it all the time because they think it is not a genre that needs to be defended. And the thing is that while I love it, I also love to deeply analyze it, which is something that we do on the pod. And reality television in all of its formats and all of its subgenres has reached kind of this point of parity, with audiences being able to recognize and anticipate familiar character types, plot points, and narrative structures. So, I mean, there's not a week or a different, place on Drag Race that can be released where I'm like, oh, that person is, going to go home first. This person is definitely going to win. And, that's their alt drag person. So you can kind of figure it out after you've been a fan of the reality TV genre for quite some years. The other thing with reality TV as well is that it's kind of moved away from being a genre that engages with politics, although there is some instances where that does happen. But also we're seeing reality TV sort of mimic politics. So case in point, The Apprentice and then Donald Trump taking office. But I don't really want to focus about Donald Trump because we've sort of moved that and deleted it from our memory, although we really can't delete it from our memory entirely. So, many culture critics like myself, Stacy, Sydney, and Sadaf, we all like to sort of break down how pop culture is really, what it's really like. And, when I think about reality television, the thing with reality television is there's always a story producer. There's always a puppet master behind the camera pulling the strings. There's always someone there that's making and producing the outlandish storylines, the drama, the memorable quotes. There's always somebody that's handling everything. And the thing that we kind of have to consider is, are they beginning to take it too far? Or is it really just the way it's always been? And that's something that we have to really think about. But I think if we think about it, I think reality television started in 2004, if I was doing my research correctly, is that, I think it was on ABC, if I remember correctly, but there was that reality television show where there was a bunch of kids on a ranch and they were sort of exploiting them to do child labor. I'm totally blanking on the title of the show. But there's things like that. And then we can also think about the Kardashian family and how they were able to embed themselves into our cultural phenomenon when, each and every single day they're really appropriating and profiting from Black culture. So anyways, that's all to say that, reality television is kind of problematic, but we can also analyze it in a way where we can look at these things and see, hey, maybe these aren't so great, but let's have a topic of discussion about it. So for me, being a plus size individual, I would say reality television really hit its stride in the 90s. I remember I would run home after school and watch TLC's Trading Spaces and What Not to Wear. Stacy London is still an icon and a legend. Let's not forget. And also she is part of the as the TikTok Gen Zs call it, Alphabet Mafia, we stand. But I would say that that's also when it started to change. So reality television show producers started to see that weight loss programming was a huge hit with viewers, and this started to shift their goals to what aligned with what mainstream media was putting out, so that the obesity epidemic was taking place and fat people were sort of taxing the health system, and that they could also sort of play into this as well and sort of make people feel a certain type of way about fat individuals in general. So in 2004 is actually when The Biggest Loser was launched onto NBC, and it was supposed to help inspire individuals to achieve their own weight loss goals. So as a fat individual who grew up trying to stay at home, count calories, and I struggled to lose weight, I didn't find this programming inspiring, if I'm being quite honest. For me, I would watch something like this, and I had struggled with the beauty industrial complex, seeing, different 17 magazines while I was growing up, and Cosmopolitan magazines, and all of these like models who were very thin and, trying to play into my negative self-esteem, as you will. And these shows sort of touted a healthier lifestyle, but what they didn't talk about really was the help that these participants get in order to obtain. So while we're showing that they have these trainers, what we're not shown is just how much it costs to maintain that sort of healthier body, if you will. And I think it doesn't also take into account the genetics, environmental factors. It also doesn't take into account the time commitment. It doesn't take into account the financial commitment. It doesn't also take into account the further context into the how or why or what. So let's say if there's mental or emotional aspects going into this, or if you're taking any sort of things in your life that could be contributing to why there is weight on your body. Maybe your body just wants to be that weight. Who knows? And yet, for some reason, shows like The Biggest Loser or any of these other shows, they don't want to talk about those things because those things don't make a good story. Those are the things that don't get people to tune in week after week. And those aren't the things that make people want to know. We don't want to empathize or sympathize with fat individuals. We just want to see fat individuals obtaining a goal and getting there. And so here's the thing. I know that for reality television, it's sometimes really difficult for me to try and defend it. But the thing is that it does have some value, and it does have some positivity. The thing is that we can have positive representation in reality television. And we did see that. So for example, Netflix had The Circle, and Sean Taylor was on that. And while she did go in as a catfish at first, we did get to see this fat, visibly fat, plus size individual who then showcased herself as someone who actually did love her body. And she did visibly talk about why she didn't go in as a visibly fat individual at first, because she was harassed on the internet for being fat. And I think those types of conversations are important. Were people mad and upset that she didn't go in at first as a visibly fat individual? Yeah, of course. But I think having the dialogue to show why that was is important, because some people don't know that that exists, even though multiple individuals talk about this each and every single day. And people talk about it on the internet, in media articles, on podcasts, what have you. And I think, like Stacy, like Sadaf have both explained, pop culture makes us feel seen. Pop culture makes us feel represented. It doesn't matter what it is. I think as we begin to navigate through pop culture, we get to know that we are represented. And when these sort of representations come out, it matters. I recently read a book and actually had them on my podcast not too long ago, Amanda Montell, and she wrote the book Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. And there's this quote from the book that says, "Words are the medium through which belief systems are manufactured, nurtured, and reinforced. Their fanaticism fundamentally could not exist without them." So when I think about pop culture, I think it's really important that we think about the words that we're using, because even though Amanda's book is about cults, we think about fandoms, we think about sort of the culture that we create, and words matter, and also the imagery that we put out into the word related to pop culture also matters. And I think we sort of need to recognize and realize that the pop culture that is out there, we need it to recognize it and be seen. So there needs to be individuals, not just fat individuals, but there needs to be individuals of all marginalized communities that are underrepresented currently in reality television, in, media of all type, YouTube, TikTok, whatever, you name it, needs to be out there. And I think getting this brief glimpse in these positive lights via reality television or what have you is so important, because it makes us seem like we could have nice things, even for that one little moment. So is reality television at its best problematic? Yes. uh, do I still want to take up space in reality television? Of course. Do I want to critique it and talk about it with my friends and say, is the Real Housewives girls trip amazing and awesome? And like, is Ramona a terrible human being for like being the worst to Kenya and calling her Portia? Absolutely. But like, let's have this conversation and let's talk about it, because television and reality television is how we sort of relate to the world. It's also how we learn about what is happening around us. It helps us also promote certain ideologies and notions to the world. Hello, Donald Trump again. And we are given the space and time to sort of escape our own worlds through these mediums as well. So, I mean, I just want to say, if there's anyone out there listening and you want to know how to make and create a plus size positive reality television show, please at me sometime. I am more than happy to help create and produce that with you. And that's me.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. So many great thoughts about reality television, which we can talk about in the Q&A. Get your reality television questions ready. And a reminder to check out the podcast that Amanda co-hosts, the High Lowbrow podcast. Check it out. And Stacy's newsletter, Friday Things, and the pop culture podcast that Sadaf hosts, The Reheat. So to check all that out. So we have one more speaker, and then we're going to get to questions. So let me introduce our last speaker. Sydney Urbanek is a Toronto-based writer on mostly movies, music videos, and things in between. When possible, she also likes using pop culture to talk about chronic illness and disability, having lived with one for 5 years. She has a Master of Arts in Cinema Studies from the University of Toronto, which gave her an institutional sign-off to more seriously consider the work of people like Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Madonna, and Britney Spears. She also writes a music video newsletter called Mononym, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Mythology, where these same names are popping up all the time. Sydney, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I mean, knowing that I was going to be going last, I really spent the last few days torturing myself that by the time we got here, everything that I was going to say would have been covered. But I think I'm mostly still in the clear, because I'm going to be talking for the most part about Britney Spears, of all people, who I've of course written about for the issue. Do I sound fine, first of all? Yeah? Okay, I have this new mic and I just don't want to be maxing everyone's speakers out. So pop culture, for me is political because it's an entry point. It's an entry point for the quote unquote average Joe to make sense of, to get into, to debate, and even maybe to care about in the first place, capital I important issues, so to speak. So, I am a white Austrian Canadian, never not lived in a city, currently speaking from 2021. But there are so many instances for me, and this will probably be very relatable to everyone here, of me even knowing something about another life or world or era because pop culture gave me a reason to be interested in them in the first place. So, I know things about, let's say, like the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s and early 90s in the Western world, not because I lived through it or have any personal relationship to it, but you get sort of a crash course in it, spending virtually any time with Madonna. So another example would be that I know Houston slang terms and about like New Orleans delicacies, having never visited either city, because I pay attention to Beyonce. I also, as a Canadian who's not in my day-to-day life super immersed in like maternal mortality statistics, I happen to know a lot about the very dire Black maternal mortality rate in the US, again, because of Beyonce. So it's just things you pick up by being exposed to these characters. And so what I'm going to talk about now comes back a little bit to what Stacy was talking about, which is, these are real people, but in some ways they take the form of characters who are living out these stories. And, without getting too academic about it unnecessarily, they're cultural texts themselves, because they are public figures and they're compelling ones at that, but they also, their stories encourage people to talk about them and to talk through them. And those conversations can be everything. They can become the whole story in the end, which is sort of what we've just seen play out this year with Britney Spears and the Free Britney movement, where the conversation ended up being the whole story. And I'll come back to her in a bit. There is this misconception in general that the world of entertainment over here, let's put it, where we pay attention to things like pop music and celebrity gossip and street style, it's separate from the world of more traditionally important things like the law, politics, government, the economy. But in actuality, not one of those things in the latter category is untouched by or immune to the things in that other category, the world of pop culture. There are laws that exist to protect child stars from their parents financially, all because of tabloid stories about child stars being taken advantage of by their parents. The line between what a celebrity is and what a politician is and what an activist is has never been blurrier. Where we've had Arnold Schwarzenegger being the governor of California. And then, of course, we had a reality television star later become president. A piece of well-timed or inflammatory celebrity gossip can like sink a stock price, which is not a world that I'm super into at all, but that'll have ripple effects just because of this weird world that we have created. Marvel and Disney they have a long history of collaborating with the US government. Bizarre as that sounds. Police unions, after Beyonce sunk a cop car in the Formation video in 2016, launched a boycott of her shows. They refused to work at them. But there are thousands and thousands of these examples, and you can think of pop culture and politics being in conversation with each other. It's probably actually more like, like two Looney Tunes characters who are fighting in one of those like ball clouds, where they're really just like an indistinguishable mass. So, there is a dialogue between the two things, but and it's not wrong to call them a dialogue, but they are also totally one and the same. So Britney Spears, who I've been told I'm not obligated to speak about, but who I have written about for the issue and spent a lot of time with, virtually and figuratively this year. She's a very interesting example because of the ways that, if I say there are thousands and thousands of these examples where these two worlds got tangled together, she's easily 24 of them. Since she was a teenager, Britney has been a character, again, a public figure, but also a character living out her particular story, and where we happen to be privy to that story because she's a public figure. Very on, we started to use her as an entry point to discuss and debate things like purity culture, the over-sexualization of women, but initially in her case, a woman who was not yet old enough to drink, which is a can of worms in itself. But by the time she's in her mid-20s, that evolved into things like slut shaming, where Justin Timberlake had hired a Britney lookalike to be in Crimea River, and then that lookalike happened to be naked and showering without knowing that Justin's character was there. And early 2000s discourse was more concerned with the fact that she'd deserved that potentially for lying about being a virgin, which was a big part of her public persona at the time, and B cheating on him, assuming that he had told the truth with the particular media narrative that he spun. So already we're talking about, I think, these overtly political issues, because what we're actually talking about is feminism and religion and sexuality. And that means that we're not at all dealing with anything like classifiable as frivolous, quote unquote, to use a word that gets thrown around all the time. At one point when she was in her early 20s, Britney, the governor of Maryland expressed publicly to the media that she wished that she could shoot Britney Spears because of how much more difficult she had made it to be a parent in the United States. And that was, of course, like an unforgivable, awful thing to say. It was also evidence, really interesting evidence, that Britney was considered to be a threat to certain institutions. Like there were eyes on her specifically because of what her whole shtick was either, upholding or putting at risk. And, a separate aside in this story, we could talk about Janet Jackson and the 2004 Super Bowl, because the Times has now set its sights on that story. And of course, there we're still dealing with things like sexuality and feminism. Now we're also dealing with race, and we're dealing with respectability issues related to Blackness in particular. And that case brought about like literal congressional hearings in the United States about like the content of what was being shown on TV. But I don't want to get too much into it because I just saw that doc on Friday and I'm trying to sit with some of my feelings. But if you weren't already convinced that this is more of like a Looney Tunes ball cloud, as I was saying, Britney's ensuing chapters bring her squarely into the realm of law and capital P politics, because she was a public figure who would be going about her business and being photographed doing it, which probably, to my knowledge, does not happen to you or to me. She'd be caught in these quote unquote compromising positions, including ones that every human being probably finds themselves in at some point, like stumbling out of a nightclub, and photographed. And so when it came time to legally, limit her time with her children, which her husband sought to do halfway through the decade, there was this bizarre case file that existed and uses evidence of why that needed to happen, and later why she needed help and why she needed to have, her legal rights taken away. So again, a case file that probably doesn't exist for you or for me. But there's this interesting, and not necessarily common case among celebrities where this public figure's personal life becomes her legal one. They're like one and the same. And that was literally true until this month. And then, of course, we get to the conservatorship, a word that, as we were saying earlier, thousands, potentially even millions of people only learned because of Britney Spears. We don't even call them that here in Canada. We call them guardianships or trusteeships. Or if they already knew about them, they perhaps had never had reason to think too hard about like the mechanics or the politics of them. So Britney's case, again, has, to reiterate things from earlier, has put a lot of scrutiny on the conservatorship system in the US in particular. And so to, Britney's file, we add, and she's already this massive bellwether for things like feminism and sexuality and like formerly purity culture, we're suddenly dealing with the disability rights issue. And there will be a ripple effect of this case, and particularly the fact that she was able to end her conservatorship in the coming months and years, because people are suddenly asking themselves questions that they were not asking before. So, hey, like, why did we make it possible to strip someone's legal rights away from them on the basis of a disability? Did everyone know that this was so common? What allowed us culturally to do this to Britney Spears? And are there others that we could be freeing too from, you know, similarly predatory, abusive arrangements? So how do we learn from it and not repeat our mistakes? So, you know, the interesting part, though, that I think is important is Britney has never argued that she doesn't live with mental illness, that she doesn't need any help of any kind. She's arguing for personal autonomy despite mental illness, alongside mental illness. That's very important to keep in mind because, you know, as Claire pointed out in the comments, that's at odds with the average line that her fan has, you know, the average fan has been using for years to try and insist that she needs to be freed from it, which, you know, and I of course, this is what my piece is about in the issue, but people have a long history of trying to speak for Britney Spears or over Britney Spears. You know, our personal politics can evolve because of what I guess amounts to a sort of parasocial connection with this woman. And that's why it's really useful to think of these people as characters. So to bring myself to the end of this like Britney Spears case study, we use pop culture, with celebrities in particular, to work through our politics. And that's in the lowercase p sense, and that's also in the capital P sense, because they happen to be one of the most accessible venues for doing that, where there's sort of a water cooler cultural touchstone aspect to it. I mean, you might not strike up a conversation with your dentist about the labor movement and workplace safety. You might talk about Alec Baldwin, right? And that's easier to do with, you know, so-called low culture or pop culture than it is with high culture, because, you know, purely based on how much of the public is fluent in someone or something. So I think I will leave things there, doing a lot with my hands. I think I need to cut myself off. So there we go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sydney. If there's anyone attending who is a dentist that loves to chat about Alec Baldwin, put your contact info in the chat. You might have some new patients here. Thank you so much, Sydney. That was really, really great. Check out the music video newsletter that Sydney does. We've put the info in the chat there, Mononym Mythology, and Sydney's piece in the Pop Culture issue on Britney Spears and why we should be paying more attention to Britney's art is great. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much to all our panelists. So much great information. We're on to the question and answer portion. So get your questions in, and we have some questions. So let's start with some questions. So we mentioned Tiger King. Let's start with a Tiger King, a question that references Tiger King. So the question here, looking at what popular media emerged during the beginning of the pandemic, for example, Tiger King, what do you think helped these forms of media come to the forefront during such an unfamiliar time?
I don't have like a nice answer, but I feel like the Tiger King went viral because it was a way for us to feel better about ourselves. Honestly, like my life is bad, but this is much worse. And no one that I know has been eaten by a tiger, allegedly. There's not like, and that's why I feel a little bit uncomfortable with Tiger King, because it like so clearly exemplifies all of these different sort of systems of oppression. There's like a drug use situation. There's just like so many things that are at play here. There's misogyny, but there's also homophobia, but there's also like, there's transphobia. And so it's actually like a little depressing that that's the thing that like so exemplifies the beginning of the pandemic for me and for so many people, is because it was really about looking down on people. And like, as someone who grew up with not a lot of money and who is an immigrant to this country and who thinks a lot about class dynamics and the ways that I've been able to transcend the class that my parents are in, it like makes me uncomfortable, even as I found it incredibly captivating. So it's like complicated.
I can say I just watched Tiger King 2 last week, which why? I'm not entirely sure. Fascination. But what I found really interesting was they went back and did sort of a mini profile on each individual from Tiger King to sort of say, because I think there was a lot of criticism from Tiger King when they first did it of how they focused so much on certain individuals and how they sort of did it. So this was a deeper dive into actually none of the people in this are good, and they're all flawed, which I found very interesting. So I thought it was a little bit better in the sense that it showcased that all of the people in the doc they all had their own personal vested interest in this, even though they were trying to remain as if, you know, I don't have any interest. I just want to see Joe go to jail. And the reality of the situation is that they were all doing bad and shady things, no matter who they were.
I just want to add one quick thing because those were great. And the only thing that I want to add actually touches back on what Stacy said much earlier. I never even watched Tiger King, and yet I know the whole story. You can bring up any part of it, I'm going to know what you're talking about. And I feel that has been forced upon me. But what I think is so fascinating about the way that everybody consumed this is because it was this moment where we're all inside, and it's a little bit of that hit back at monoculture again, which Stacy referred to earlier. And it's this collective experience. Everybody was having it together. There was something kind of beautiful about that. I remember going on some terrible virtual dates at the time. It was the one thing that how many siblings do you have? Where did you grow up? And did you watch Tiger King? No. That's okay, because I also just loved that everybody was so united by that. That's another beautiful thing that I think we have about pop culture. It's a language, and so many of us speak it, and that is phenomenal. And it's a great example of a water cooler conversation or an elevator conversation you can have rather than mentioning the weather. I'd much rather you bring up Tiger King.
Well, it kind of reminds me too of, I feel like, and anybody on the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, once Tiger King was done, it felt like the next one was the documentary on Crave about Nexium. And then everybody was talking about that. So I don't know. We just thrive off of chaos.
I think you're right. And I'm sure Sydney would have more to say about this, but I think that's also why Britney became an even bigger subject. Everything was so amplified during all this period because maybe we were bored, but also that's not always a bad thing.
Actually, that is such a good, like, Sydney, do you think that the conservatorship kind of, oh no, she froze. Okay,
Yep,
my
we
question when
lost
she
her.
comes back though is like, I'm genuinely, okay, I'll wait, never mind. Okay.
He's back.
Sydney, I really actually want to get your thoughts on this. Do you think that the conservatorship discourse would have gotten as much traction if it hadn't been the pandemic? Like if we weren't all glued to our TV screens, phones, computers?
It's such a good question. I think it would be dishonest to say that it didn't have any impact on the speed with which everything happened. I think, from the fan perspective, in terms of the fans that were building a case on their own, they suddenly could do that. They could suddenly spend time outside courthouses and wait for updates. And like that aspect of the whole landscape really did change. And it's sort of fascinating the way that like the Times doc, which I kind of lay into in my piece for the issue, but it's such an interesting time capsule because everyone has a mask on standing outside the courthouse. I think it will be remembered maybe as something that really exploded during this moment. I don't know if if that will be true for everyone. It hadn't really even occurred to me until you asked whether that may have played a role. So yeah, I don't know. It's also interesting, like I haven't seen Tiger King, but to come back to what Staff was saying about like, it's a language that you speak or you very much don't speak. And like everyone here happens to speak it. So it's really nice to be able to just like, where we've all just been saying names and like everyone knows who we're talking about. But when you find yourself with someone that does not speak it, you can't, get the same kind of value, I guess, out of these conversations. And I think that that's why there are these particular names that like everyone comes back to. And they're the sort of like zenith people, the Beyoncés of the world, for example, where like you can assume speaking to someone that they know who you're talking about. Yeah.
There are so many times where in the last year, I have just said, I will never financially recover from this.
I know. And like, so, okay, I think the question got deleted, but the question about what was the last TV show you watched? Like, guys, I don't watch TV. I don't have time. I have like 3 jobs and I feel overwhelmed by all the things that I could be watching, but it affects my ability to understand pop culture. Not at all. I read the articles. I watch the things if I'm going to write about them. And then I still have the shorthand though. And the memes. The memes help a lot, I will say.
Yeah, I've become I have when I'm winding down at night, I have a 45-minute meme wind down.
I have a 9-hour TikTok scroll, so I understand.
Yeah, it's essential to your evening wind down. So same. I feel like because I work in social full time, I do not want to be on the internet at night because it makes me want to die. But my last TV show that I have watched, which I think I answered Lisa, was Real Housewives Girls Trip. So now I just want to talk to everyone about it. And I'm very mad that Slice did not send me a package with the hat and the everything. So Slice, I'm mad at you.
What's interesting is now I'm thinking about my answer to that question about the pandemic. And I think like, universally, everybody last year had a lot of time to suddenly think, right?
Yeah.
What kind of world do we want to go back to? What happens next? How have we all been behaving as humans? And I think that, more than like the pandemic itself, the time to like reevaluate. And of course, there is a bit of a trend right now of these stories coming out revisiting narratives of especially figures from the early 2000s in particular and saying, how did we treat this person? Why did we do that? I'm thinking about like how Paris Hilton had her own documentary, the Lorena Bobbitt series on Amazon Prime. So, and there's been a lot of really interesting criticism being written about like, are we casting too wide of a net? Does Tammy Faye Baker need to be included in this list of women that we're revisiting the legacies of? Because it's a real trend right now. Like we're sort of looking back at these figures that we like remember as A and saying, hey, was this actually B? So I think Britney Spears, it was actually B. I don't know about Cruella de Vil, right? Like that's sort of yet to be seen, but it's very much like a trend right now in pop culture is rehashing. And I think a lot of it has to do with millennial nostalgia, because these are the figures that we all grew up with, but where we were not necessarily the ones with any decision-making power. So, you watch something like Framing Britney Spears in my case, and I think, oh, wow, I feel so guilty. And then I'm like, what am I talking about? I was 12 years old when this happened. I was not like writing those tabloids. I was not, writing late night jokes. Like, what does this have to do with me? But yeah, so that's my amended answer.
Okay, but like on that point, I also felt very guilty because I believed what I read. Like, I think that is the thing that makes it really difficult for me, is that even as at the time, like I discovered feminism in high school and I was like really, but like I discovered feminism through feminist blogs, so it was also a very like white, not very intersectional lens. And so I was like consuming all of this information, which like goes to, I know we have a question to get to about that idea of consumption, but like here I was really like truly inhaling everything that I could read, but also not necessarily being able to apply that to what I was seeing in media. So I had these like ideas about, or actually it also kind of internalizing ideas about what good women looked like anyways. So that I was getting from the feminist sphere as well. So like I had these ideas about Britney Spears about that were really just like slut shamey, insecure feelings. And so that's what I think is part of the revisiting is like there was some complicity in the conversations we had to like that question about where do we need to, like, if the pop culture is happening on the internet, like where else does it have to happen? I think that's what it is. It's the offline conversations. And like a couple of people said that, a couple of people talked about having these great conversations about gender and power through the Real Housewives. I've had really good conversations about gender and transphobia and what it means to like be an accepting person with family members who this is not their language at all. This is not something that they think about or have been really exposed to at all. And so there's this like chance to, at least for me, like undo some of the conversations that I had with my friends when I was 12, being like, oh my God, I would never dress like Britney. Like, I absolutely would have had I had Britney's body and had Britney's like career and had like on a superficial level, but also on a, let's acknowledge like what her career was and the powers that were kind of at play behind her. There's nothing separating me from Britney Spears in that way. So it's kind of like an undoing of that, I think. That was very rambly. Apologies. And I tried to answer 7 questions in it.
We were supposed to wrap, but do we have time for one more question? Does everyone feel like one more question? Okay, let's do one more question before we wrap up. So there's a question, and I'm interested to hear everyone's answer to this. Curious if any of you ever go back and rewatch old shows that have scenes or characters that are problematic for whatever reasons. There's so many reasons, and we've got Hi Friends here in brackets, the television show Friends. Do you avoid or watch despite the content? Problematic shows. How do we deal with them? Shows that haven't aged. I know, a show like Friends that maybe hasn't aged particularly well.
I go back and watch shows that haven't aged well. And I mean, I think sometimes you don't even realize that they haven't aged well. And then you're like, oh, ooh, that was a yikes. And I think now having a better understanding of certain things that I didn't know when I was younger, I'm able to have a more critical lens on and take a look at that piece of culture, whether it be film, television, whatever, and I can look at it for what it was and also see, like, let's say it was in the 80s when I was growing up. I think last Christmas we went to go see Gremlins, and there was some things in there that was questionably problematic. But I mean, did they perhaps know any of that stuff in the 80s? Maybe not. Does that excuse it? No. It just means that I also didn't know it because I was probably 4 at the time. So
Yeah, I'm with you. There's so many. I mean, I'm a big Friends fan, but going back and watching some of those episodes, ooh, it's rough. For example, Sex and the City, which I know this has been a conversation quite a bit in the last couple of years, especially with the new series coming out. But there's problematic characters, problematic episodes, storylines, you name it. I think the thing that I always think, though, is that that doesn't mean that we need to erase that from our history. It's okay to still love those shows and to watch them. It's actually a great vehicle for, as I just said, kind of learning how things have changed and why that doesn't work today, and actually why it never did, but why we have the resources to understand why now. It's such a good resource for conversation. I've had so many great ones with friends and family rewatching them now, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think this also goes back to the other question about consumption. I think when media gets to that point where it really just feels like we're just taking it all down, there's a blindness that sets in and an ignorance. And, be really conscious of what you're watching. I think this is actually one thing I wanted to say earlier, but media literacy is just so important. And what we're doing right now is having that. And I think you should all have those conversations with your friends and family because it makes such a difference. And that's a good example of this. We don't need to cancel those shows. We can learn from them. And there's something to be said about that, I think, personally.
Right. I think that any final thoughts anyone wants to give? Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
I just want to repeat the words media literacy is so important. Like that's the takeaway, right? Like that's the takeaway for why pop culture is important, how you combat fake news, like why Facebook is what Facebook is, and like how like those even, I don't know, my parents are these like super smart, lovely, talented people who I still have to be like, no, Dad, that's a scam. So like we need to be prepared to actually parse what we're seeing and reading. And like there's so much media, there's so many shows, there's so many books, there's so many, like all the things. So that point I think is like, if there's one takeaway, remember that.
Yeah, there's so many times where I will chat with folks and always I'm just like, media literacy, scream it from the mountains. Because and thank you, Sadaf, for bringing that up, because I think it's like genuinely the most important thing that people can learn and take away.
I do actually want to add one thing to it. If all of your friends feel one way about something, for example, this might not be the best, but if they all hate Kim Kardashian for whatever reason, take that in, talk about it, but it doesn't have to be your opinion. Form your own, educate yourself. I have a different perspective on Kim Kardashian that I could do a whole conversation on. I think that she's great, and I think she has some flaws to her, but I think she's made a lot of good change in pop culture. Can't get into that now, but I do think, that shows you it's so important to do your own reading, your own research, take things in the way you want to, and do not beat yourself up if you are a fan of something that the majority is not. That's okay. You don't need to agree with everybody else. Form your own opinions. That's the best thing about pop culture. You get to have what you love.
Let people like things.
I feel like we could do this every week, and we could do it next week talking about Kim Kardashian West. There's our first topic. I want, before I turn it over to Tara Michelle, I just want to thank you all, our panelists. Thank you so much. So many great thoughts. We're recording this. I'm going to go back and replay it so I can catch what I missed. Pete Davidson. Oh, don't get me started. We'll be here for another 2 hours. Maybe we can add Pete Davidson onto Kim Kardashian West. I feel like we can't do Kim Kardashian West without talking about Pete Davidson. So I'm going to turn over to Tara Michelle. Thank you so much to the panelists. So this was really, really great. And thank you to everyone for watching and participating. So much great stuff going on in the chat and great questions. Tara Michelle, over to you.
Oh, but you're muted.
Oh.
Okay, I'm here now, right? I was saying before, we do run a culture column in every issue, even the ones that are about more hard news type topics. So, you can follow along with our pop culture takes. And if any of you who are listening to this later or are in the audience now are interested in writing about pop culture, you can always email me at editor@this.org. And you can find that very easily online. And we'd love to hear your pop culture hot takes. I put in all of the information about following us on social media, signing up for our newsletter, buying the issue, subscribing. We have a great $20 subscription sale right now. Subscriptions also make great gifts. I don't feel bad plugging us because we are a nonprofit and we really need the support. And this has been a great discussion. I want to thank everybody who attended today, as well as Lisa and all of our speakers. We are doing an open issue next. We have a couple of features. One is about employee rights and pregnancy loss, and one is about the mental health effects of climate change. And there's lots of other great stuff in there. The culture column in that piece is about why we need more disability representation in scripted television. And then our issue after that is going to be about climate justice. We're going to be taking pitches for that next month. So if you get on our newsletter or follow us on social media, you'll see when we're taking pitches, and you just to know what's coming up in the next couple of issues, I guess. Yeah, and you can keep an eye on our website under talk series for future We Need to Talk About This events that will probably coincide with some of our themed issues in the coming year. So yeah, that is everything from us. And thank you again for being here. And we hope to keep in touch.